Waitress stands up to bullies, changes everything for special needs girl and her father. Hey, beautiful souls. Your support absolutely lights up my world. A quick subscribe would mean everything. It helps me share more heartwarming stories with our amazing community. Here's my promise. I personally reply to every comment because connecting with you matters deeply to me. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I can't wait to meet you. Ready for today's extraordinary tale? Let's dive in together. Margaret Chen's weathered hands moved with practiced precision as she poured coffee at the Rosewood Diner, the same ritual she'd performed for 37 years. The morning light filtered through smudged windows, casting familiar shadows across worn vinyl booths where politicians, celebrities, and construction workers all received the same genuine smile and steady service. But this Tuesday in October carried a different weight in the air, thick with the kind of tension that makes seasoned waitresses pause and listen. In booth 7, a little girl with Down syndrome sat alone, her soft brown curls framing a face streaked with tears. The yellow dress with tiny daisies seemed to mock the cruelty echoing from the adjacent table, where teenage boys punctuated their breakfast with cruel laughter. Margaret's chest tightened as she watched the scene unfold, the child's small hands folded in her lap like a prayer, her father's expensive suit a barrier between him and his daughter's silent suffering as he barked into his phone about quarterly projections. Margaret had raised 4 children and knew intimately the particular ache that comes with watching a child feel different. Her youngest, Danny, born with cerebral palsy, had worn that same expression of trying to disappear into himself. She recognized the way the 8-year-old's shoulders curved inward, the desperate attempt to become invisible while the world decided whether to notice or ignore her pain. The businessman's voice carried sharp edges as he discussed market volatility, his attention buried so deep in corporate concerns that he might as well have been on another planet. Margaret had served his type before. Successful, driven, probably well-meaning, but missing the forest for the trees while their children withered in plain sight. "Hi there, sweetheart," Margaret said softly, sliding the coffee pot onto the table and settling across from the child. "I'm Margaret. What's your name?" Startled brown eyes looked up, swimming with unshed tears. "I'm Sophie," came the whispered response. "Those boys are being mean to me." The ache in Margaret's chest bloomed into something fiercer as she glanced toward the teenagers. The ringleader, all bleached hair and cruel smirk, was contorting his face in an exaggerated mimicry of Sophie's expressions, while his friends dissolved into laughter. Her expression, perhaps the echo of grandmothers and consequences, shifted the boy's demeanor. "Whatever," he muttered, but the mocking stopped like a faucet turned off. Margaret returned to Sophie, whose wide eyes held a hope so fragile it might shatter if breathed on wrong. "Thank you," Sophie whispered. "Nobody ever tells them to stop." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, her throat constricting around the implications. How many times had this precious child endured such cruelty while the adults around her remained oblivious or indifferent? At the neighboring booth, the businessman, Sophie's father, finally ended his call, his impatience radiating outward as he reached for his wallet. He was younger than Margaret had expected, maybe 45, with graying temples and the kind of exhaustion that success extracts as payment. "Sophie, we need to go," he announced, already standing. "I have another meeting in 20 minutes. Sophie's face crumpled like paper. "But Daddy, I haven't finished my pancakes." Margaret watched the familiar dance, the father's glance at his expensive watch, the internal calculation between schedule and daughter, the weight of a busy life pressing down on a small moment that mattered infinitely more than he realized. She had witnessed this particular tragedy countless times, but it never stopped breaking her heart. "Excuse me," Margaret said, approaching his table with the careful directness of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to give. "I don't mean to intrude, but I noticed your daughter seems upset. Those boys were bothering her earlier." James Morrison looked genuinely surprised, his corporate armor cracking just enough to let confusion seep through. "What boys?" For the first time all morning, James really looked at Sophie, not the cursory glance to check her readiness, but an actual examination that revealed tear-stained cheeks and hunched shoulders. Sophie, honey, what happened? He asked, his business voice softening into something that remembered how to be a father. Sophie glanced between her father and Margaret, clearly torn between truth and the desire to avoid causing trouble. They were making faces at me, she finally admitted, her voice barely audible, saying I look funny and talk weird. James felt something cold and terrible settle in his stomach like spoiled food. He had been 3 feet away from his daughter while she endured torment, completely oblivious, discussing profit margins while his child's heart broke in real time. Your daughter is beautiful and sweet, Margaret told him quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had loved difficult children through impossible circumstances. But children like Sophie need extra protection from the world's cruelty. They feel everything more deeply. The weight of realization crashed down on James like a building collapsing in slow motion. How many moments of pain had he missed while rushing toward the next meeting, the next deal, the next mountain to climb? His throat felt raw as he watched Sophie finally take a real bite of her pancakes, calmer now that the teenagers had left and the kind waitress remained nearby. But Margaret's experienced eye caught something deeper, a resignation in the way Sophie glanced at her father, as if she had grown accustomed to being an afterthought in his ambitious life. How often does this happen? James asked his daughter, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie pushed a piece of pancake around her plate like she was rearranging the world to make it make sense. A lot, she said quietly. At school, at the playground, in restaurants, people stare and whisper. The words made James physically sick. His daughter had been navigating a world of judgment and cruelty largely alone while he congratulated himself on providing private schools and medical care, as if money could substitute for presence. Margaret refilled his coffee cup with movements gentle and unhurried despite the breakfast rush building around them. She had seen enough broken families to recognize a man coming to terms with his own blindness. Mr. Morrison, she said, having overheard his name during one of his calls, your daughter is lucky to have you, but she needs more than financial security. She needs to know she's your priority. The simple truth hit James like a sledgehammer. When was the last time he had really spent time with Sophie? Not hurried bedtime stories or distracted car rides, but actual focused time where she had his complete attention. He couldn't remember, and that realization made his chest ache with shame. I work so hard to give her everything, he said, more to himself than to Margaret. The best therapists, the best schools, anything she might need. Material things are important, Margaret agreed gently. But what she needs most is to feel valued by her father. Children with special needs often think they're burdens. Sophie needs to know she's a joy, not a responsibility. At that moment, Sophie looked up from her pancakes with those trusting brown eyes that held the power to destroy him completely. Daddy, are you disappointed that I'm different? The question pierced James's heart like a blade finding the exact space between ribs. How could his precious daughter, the light of his life despite his terrible way of showing it, think such a thing? Oh, sweetheart, no, he said, reaching across to take her small hand. You're perfect exactly as you are. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel otherwise. But even as he spoke, James knew the words weren't enough to undo months of benign neglect. Sophie smiled, but it was the practiced smile of a child who had learned not to expect too much from her father's attention. Margaret watched this exchange with a mixture of hope and concern, recognizing the pattern of a workaholic parent who made promises in moments of crisis, only to fall back into old habits once the immediate guilt faded. Instead of moving on to other customers, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She sat down beside Sophie with the deliberate action of someone choosing love over efficiency. You know what, honey? I think your daddy needs to learn something important about what makes little girls feel special. And I think I know just the way to teach him. James Morrison, accustomed to being the one who made decisions and set terms, found himself at the mercy of a diner waitress who seemed to understand his daughter better than he did. What did you have in mind? He asked, surprised by his own willingness to surrender control. Sophie, would you like to show your daddy what you've been drawing in that notebook you brought? Sophie's eyes lit up with surprise and pleasure. James hadn't even noticed she had brought anything. Another small failure that stung like a paper cut in salt water. Sophie carefully pulled out a worn notebook, opening it to reveal page after page of remarkably detailed colored pencil drawings. Their house with flowers in front, a dog they didn't have playing in a yard, and most poignantly, drawings of herself and James together doing things they'd never actually done: flying kites, baking cookies, reading stories under a tree. Each drawing was signed with Sophie Morrison in careful, proud letters. "These are beautiful, Princess," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "This one here," he pointed to a drawing of them having a picnic. "When did you draw this?" Sophie looked down shyly. "I draw things I wish we could do together. Miss Jennifer at school says imagination is important." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Sophie has quite a talent. She's been showing me her drawings every time you come in here." Another stab of realization. His daughter had been regularly sharing her artwork with a virtual stranger because her own father never made time to look. The waitress had become more of a confidant to Sophie than he had. "You know what?" James said, making a decision that surprised even himself. "I'm canceling my meetings today." He pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly, sending message after message, rescheduling appointments that were probably worth millions of dollars. Margaret watched as this powerful businessman chose presence over profit, perhaps for the first time in years. Sophie stared at her father in amazement. "Are you sure, Daddy? What about your important meeting?" James looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw past the Down syndrome to the bright, creative, loving person she was. "You're my most important meeting," he said, and for the first time in months, he meant it completely. Margaret smiled as she watched father and daughter plan an impromptu day together, with James asking Sophie what she'd like to do, and listening to her answers with the same focused attention he usually reserved for corporate presentations. It was a small moment, but Margaret had seen enough families to know that small moments could change everything. As Margaret prepared to return to her other customers, Sophie tugged on her apron. "Thank you for being nice to me," the little girl said, "and for helping my daddy remember how to see me." Sometimes, Margaret thought, the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. 3 months later, Margaret was wiping down tables during the quiet afternoon lull when she heard the familiar chime of the diner's front door. She looked up to see James and Sophie Morrison walking in, both wearing matching smiles and paint-stained clothes. The transformation was remarkable. James looked years younger, his perpetual tension replaced by genuine contentment, while Sophie practically glowed with confidence and joy. "Margaret," Sophie called out, rushing over to give the waitress a tight hug. "Look what Daddy and I made." She proudly held up a canvas painted with bright swirls of blue and yellow, abstract but clearly made with love and laughter. James followed more slowly, carrying what appeared to be his own artistic attempt, a slightly lopsided but charming landscape. "We've been taking art classes together," James explained, settling into their usual booth. "Sophie's been teaching me about colors and imagination. Turns out I have a lot to learn." Margaret poured their coffee and chocolate milk without being asked, marveling at how relaxed James seemed. Gone was the man who used to check his phone every 30 seconds and rush Sophie through meals. "The funny thing is," James continued, "I thought I'd lose everything by working less, but my companies are actually doing better. When you're present for the important moments, you make better decisions across the board." He reached over and squeezed Sophie's hand. "Plus, I discovered I have the most amazing daughter in the world. I just had to slow down enough to notice." Sophie beamed at her father's words, then turned to Margaret with excitement. "Daddy's coming to my school play next week, and we're getting a dog, and every Tuesday is our special art day." Margaret felt her heart swell with satisfaction. This was why she'd stayed at the diner all these years, not for the modest paycheck or the routine, but for moments like these when she could make a real difference in people's lives. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've learned that the most successful people aren't necessarily the ones with the most money or the biggest offices. They're the ones who know what truly matters and have the courage to prioritize it." James nodded, understanding completely. A wise waitress once told me that Sophie needed to feel valued, not just provided for. Best business advice I ever received. As they prepared to leave, Sophie handed Margaret a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a drawing of the three of them in the diner, with Margaret wearing a cape like a superhero. At the bottom, in Sophie's careful handwriting, were the words, "Margaret the Kindness Angel." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she hugged the little girl who had taught her just as much as she'd taught them. James shook Margaret's hand warmly. "Thank you," he said simply. "You saved my relationship with my daughter. I can never repay that." Margaret smiled, thinking of all the families she'd watched struggle and heal over the decades. "Just keep being present for her," she said. "That's all any child really wants." As father and daughter walked out of the diner hand in hand, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've changed someone's life for the better. Sometimes, the most profound transformations begin with the smallest acts of kindness, a willingness to speak up for a vulnerable child, to offer wisdom to a struggling parent, to remind busy people what truly matters in life. In the end, love, presence, and kindness proved to be the greatest gifts they could offer each other.